I'd just like to discuss some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that structural reform presents. But before I do that, I think we probably do need to talk briefly about what we mean by structural reform. Now, if I had to sum it up in one simple sentence, it would simply be this. Structural reform is a set of government policies that reduce barriers to competition. I think it's really that simple. It improves the operation of markets and, of course, it corrects market failures. Our discussions on structural reform will cut to the core of two very major priorities. The first one is always preferring long-term policy over short-term politics, and secondly, always bringing our people with us when we undertake big economic reforms and engaging in a full and frank discussion with all of our citizens about the benefits of long-term reform. That is absolutely critical. Just as it is vital that we have a long-term vision to take tough decisions to produce the benefits for the future, it's absolutely vital that we engage those that are impacted by such reforms, because without doing that, reform simply isn't possible. So structural reform doesn't always grab the headlines in a positive way. It is often a thankless task for those that undertake it, but it does bring great promise of great benefit for the long term, because it's the primary means by which we lift the potential growth of our economies and therefore the living standards of all of our people. So this meeting provides us as ministers who are undertaking structural reform with the opportunity to share and to learn from the experiences of others. And I'd just like to take a few moments to talk about the Australian experience of reform, because we in Australia have had first-hand experience of how structural reform can inject vitality into a mature economy. Now, before the 1970s, Australia found itself with a highly protected manufacturing industry, rigid labour markets and numerous statutory monopolies. In short, we had a highly regulated and an anti-competitive economy. For many years leading up to this, there was a strong global economy, good prices and robust demand for all of our rural and mining exports. But these things masked the inefficiencies and economic costs created by such a regime. And of course, when the global economy turned down in the 1970s, we found ourselves not only with rising unemployment, but also with high inflation as well. Now, in response, Australia embarked on an ambitious program of structural reform right through the 80s and through the early 90s. It's just worthwhile going through all of those. They are a very formidable list. We cut tariffs, we deregulated finance, we floated the Australian dollar, we introduced enterprise bargaining to determine wages, we imposed an inflation target on the central bank and gave it the ability to pursue it. We imposed tougher, new competition rules. We privatised some government businesses and put others on a commercial basis. Now that wave of reform evolved over time and it swept through the entire economy. And of course, Australia reaped the benefits of that extensive reform. Let's just look at what happened after that. Our labour productivity increased by over 40% since the beginning of the 1990s. And since 1991, Australia's output increased by 4/5, and we now employ an additional 3 million people, an increase of nearly 40%. So what we did was we fundamentally changed the way we did things, and we have become a much more open and outwardly focused economy. For example, our trade share increased from around 20% of GDP in 1970 to over 40%, of GDP. And of course, as our trade has grown, it has become more diverse. Australia's exports of services and elaborately transformed manufactures are now bigger than the rural exports that were once the backbone of our economy. But of course, we know we cannot always rely on the benefits of past action. What we have to do is we have to be in the process of putting in place reform for the future. And of course Australia now does have a new agenda for reform. We are again experiencing buoyant terms of trade. Australia's terms of trade are the highest in over 50 years, driven by strong global demand for our commodities. And of course this has helped drive economic and employment growth over recent years. But of course this has brought with it some challenges for us to tackle. And while our economy has been supported by strong demand, largely from the economies represented in this room, in recent years we have not been sufficiently investing in our productive capacity. And of course this has resulted in capacity constraints and infrastructure bottlenecks in our roads, rails and ports, and of course it has resulted in shortages of skilled labour. And as a result, productivity growth in Australia is again languishing at an unacceptable low level. Now these factors are contributing to inflationary pressures within the Australian economy, and that is why we are committed to tackling these challenges head on. Australia is once again committed to an ambitious program of structural reform, and we will use the once-in-a-generation opportunity to modernise our economy and to secure our prosperity beyond the mining boom. And of course this is the central objective of the Rudd Labor government. For the first time in Australian history, we have created a very large fund which we can use specifically to modernise our infrastructure of ports, roads, rail and communications. And we have created another fund to enhance our education system and our skills training. And we've created a third fund to improve our health system, to invest in hospitals, medical technology equipment and medical research facilities and projects. All of this is part of a broader agenda to invest in the drivers of economic growth and to remove the burdens which have been placed on business. Now, of course, this agenda revolves around three key reform processes. Firstly is the introduction of a carbon pollution reduction scheme. Second is the most comprehensive review of Australia's tax system in a generation. And third is the modernisation of our federation. Now, climate change is the greatest economic challenge of our time. Australia's carbon pollution reduction scheme will ensure that Australia transitions to a modern, low-emissions economy at least cost. The government will introduce the scheme in a measured and responsible manner. And as part of this approach, this means taking decisive action now. For the longer we wait to take action on climate change, the sharper the adjustment to the economy will be when we are forced to act. The second reform, the reform of Australia's tax and transfer system, will underwrite Australia's global competitiveness, make the economy more productive and lift our workforce participation in the face of an ageing population. The far-reaching reforms to Commonwealth-state relations will provide a platform for long-term fundamental microeconomic and social reforms. In education, for example, the Commonwealth is working with the states to improve access to high-quality early childhood education, lifting teacher quality and boosting the overall skill level of the Australian workforce. The modernisation of the Federation will also help create a seamless national economy governed by a consistent set of regulations. Now, together, these reforms will help secure Australia's long-term prosperity and shore up Australia's strong economic foundations in the face of existing global economic turbulence. These same global factors, of course, are at play right across the Asia-Pacific region. On the one hand, growth for the developed APEC economies is expected to slow to 1.8% in 2008, after growing by 2.6% in 2007. This slowing largely reflects the impact of recent global financial market turbulence. The resulting increases in borrowing costs, tightening credit standards and flow-on impacts on confidence, of course, are impacting on all of our economies. And at the same time, inflationary pressures remain elevated in the region on the back of higher global food and energy prices. And of course these effects have yet to run their full course. Now, despite this slowing growth in mature economies, growth in emerging and developing APEC economies is forecast to remain robust at 8.1% in 2008. Such growth will provide the continued momentum for increasing per capita incomes and furthering economic development. However, such rapid growth can create its own challenges. Internally generated inflationary pressures can exacerbate the effects of high food and energy prices on consumer price inflation. And in this challenging global economic context, structural reform is the common solution to many of these challenges. It can stimulate growth, improve productivity and inject vitality into all of our economies. But of course we all know that structural reform isn't easy. I'm sure you all share Australia's deep disappointment that the Doha trade negotiations failed to reach agreement last week. We are clearly in a time of global economic difficulty, and the global economy could have done with a boost that deal could have delivered to the world. That agreement would have delivered real benefits to all of our economies, and we should not lose sight of how close we were to an agreement. So while we may not have succeeded this time around, achieving significant global trade and investment liberalisation in the future is not only possible, it is absolutely imperative, and we must not give up. To do so would fail all of our children. If the APEC experience tells us anything, it is that those who make the tough decisions to modernise their economies deliver the best outcomes for their people and for future generations. And of course this brings us back to the structural reform agenda that we're talking about today, because our region has gained greatly from the reforms of the past and as a result is the most dynamic in the world. It's the home to rapidly developing economies, flourishing global production networks and massive investment flows. It's also the major force of global economic growth. Since its establishment in 1989, APEC member economies have generated more than 60% of global economic growth. And if the APEC region consistently outperformed the rest of the world, even during the 1997-1998 Asian financial crisis. APEC's mission is to continue that impressive economic performance. We are determined to promote sustainable economic growth and improve living standards across the Asia-Pacific region through enhanced trade and economic integration. As APEC's trade agenda has advanced, there have been increasing recognition that removing non-trade or behind-the-border barriers is equally important in achieving economic growth. And so the APEC agenda has evolved to place a strong emphasis on the reform of structural or behind-the-border barriers in the region. A forum such as this offers APEC economies a valuable opportunity to share and exchange insights and experiences on vitally important elements of structural reform. APEC is ideally positioned to promote economic reform across the Asia-Pacific because of its capacity to evolve and respond to new challenges and its cooperative, non-binding, consensual approach. These features contribute to APEC's success as a regional forum and I think do distinguish it from other rules-based multilateral bodies. Because structural policies are domestic in nature, they are sometimes not well suited for negotiation between economies. So APEC also provides the ideal context for us to consider our next steps in tackling structural reform issues in the region. I would also like to highlight another feature of APEC, one which is central to its success as a regional forum. We recognise differences as well as the similarities between our economies in an open manner. We recognise that member economies have differing starting points and priorities. We recognise that each economy must take its own path to reform. But despite all of the differences, we do share so much in common. We have faced similar challenges and similar experiences, and we have learnt valuable lessons that we can share with each other. We know that each step in our different paths to reform must be informed by sound economic principles on what makes markets efficient. Our similarities are also about paving the way forward and forging further initiatives to support structural reform efforts in the region and meeting the big challenges of our time. Which brings me to the agenda. I know many of you recognise these challenges and are reaffirming your commitments to structural reform. But when embarking on these reforms, we all understand that reform does not occur in a political or in a social vacuum. Achieving structural reform is tough work, and we need to all help each other if we are going to be successful. That's why I'm looking forward to our discussions over these 2 days, where we can reflect on our own experiences, share useful tips, offer assistance to one another in our reform endeavours. The first theme of this ministerial meeting this morning, the political challenges of structural reform, is relevant to all of our economies, developed and developing alike. It recognises the importance of building consensus to achieve sustainable structural reform. Our proposed agenda will allow us to look at some of the determinants of successful reform and how we can utilise different institutional frameworks, strategies and processes to achieve reform. And of course, regulation is one of the key instruments governments use to implement structural reform. We know that regulation influences the behaviour of firms and individuals, and that it can be used to achieve important economic, social and environmental objectives. But inappropriate or poorly designed regulation can be a barrier to competitive, efficient markets and sustained economic growth. Such regulation can ultimately impact negatively on living standards. And in particular, I look forward to the opportunity for a dialogue with our APEC business representatives. The business community has a vital role to play in the structural reform process. It's a brave politician that does not engage the business community in the structural reform process. Business perspectives can also help inform the design of our structural reform policies and help build consensus for reform, not just letting us know when we've gone too far or regulated too much. That's why the discussions with our business colleagues are such an important part of this meeting. And of course, tomorrow we will discuss regulatory reform frameworks which can facilitate structural reform. Effective regulatory reform frameworks provide a better process for making and reviewing regulation. And this helps governments strike the right balance between the need for regulation and the cost imposed on business. So our proposed agenda will allow us to consider the elements of good regulatory reform frameworks which will help us lock in good structural reform processes. So, structural reform is an ongoing process and it needs to take place within the context of each individual economy. It's a vital part of sound economic management, and I certainly look forward to the insightful and fruitful conversation that I know we will have over the next couple of days. So welcome once again to this meeting.